Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we did the first one. Focus. I did put the schedule up on the board. If you missed what Dr. Keely said, if you need that for tomorrow, yes. The first part of the second one. He said two different things about it. Tomorrow they're not changing, and starting today, all of the lunch lines are combined, something like that. Subline is combined with main lunch line. I wasn't really listening to that one. Lunch lines are combined for the rest of
Wait,
I don't know what that means. I guess you'll see it when you go down. So you'll see when you get done. Yes. It may be. This work.
nobody even go there.
Okay, so let's go through number 2. Read through it, find important information, and then let's solve this. So ounces of medication vary directly with the weight of the patient. If 120 pounds adult requires 3/4 of an ounce of medication. How many ounces are required for a 200-pound adult? What's important? 120. Okay, 120. What is medication? 4 ounces. The ounces of medication in general. What are we looking for?
How many ounces?
And it says the word very directly. So whatever comes before the word very directly is your Y. Whatever comes after is X. Let's see if they don't hear me. Also, I need your hands. Alright, so every time we see weight, that's our X. Every time we see ounces, that's our Y. So are we looking for X or Y? Y. So we're looking for a number of ounces. Okay. Good luck. So then, thinking back to how we were solving yesterday, take the two numbers that you're given, 120 and 3/4, and use that to find K. Since 3/4 would be a fraction, we don't want a fraction within a fraction, change it to a decimal. And that would be ounces per pound. What would that be? You will get a decimal. So we talked about this yesterday. You'll have to go back and watch the video. So when you're doing these word problems, you have to think about, does this make sense? So let's say you flipped this by accident and you got 90. Would 90 ounces of medication per pound make sense? Oh no, that's way too much. If you don't put it all the way in there. But this amount of medication per pound would make sense. So then we're gonna set up the equation. We're looking for Y, we have X, we have K. How would that look? Y equals decimal 0.00625. Multiply that, figure out what Y is. 1.25 what? And then you can also think about your answer. So one, if you put the wrong label, would 1.25 pounds make sense if you're talking about medications? That's way too much. And then if you got something ridiculous, some other number, think about would that make sense for a 200-pound person to have that amount of medication? This is like average for that amount of weight. Lower would probably be like if they were 120, the 3/4. But this is already a pretty small decimal. So it's gonna be smaller. It shouldn't be like 10. It shouldn't be something crazy like that. Questions on this? All right, we're gonna do one more. Any you guys want to see, and then move on to inverse. So number 5. The income of a computer analyst varies directly as the number of hours worked. If the analyst earned $256 for working 8 hours, find the constant variation. What is important there? Varies directly. What is the income of the computer analyst, the number of hours worked, and then our actual two numbers, 256 and 8. And what are we looking for? Constant. So how would we find the constant of variation? Find the k value. How would we do that? Oh, 56 divided by 8. Because the income is y and the hours is x. This would be dollars per hour. $32 per hour. And then does it ask us to find anything else? Did we find that? Yes, so that's it. Don't keep going. Don't start solving random things. Stop where it tells you to stop. Right. Do we have questions on that one? Are there any other questions on this page we want to see you go over, have questions about? Okay, so now we're going to do inverse. Some of you are going to get split packets because it didn't print correctly. I'll pass out some of these other. Everyone else that are passing out, you're gonna get a packet and sheet of paper. No, it should have been in the packet, but it's not. If you want to leave out your food sections, you can compare, you can.
Oh, And we're gonna table it again.
If you want. If you want. Right, so now we're on inverse variation. A lot of the things we do in inverse will be very similar to direct, but how we do it will be a little different. Because the equations are different for inverse than they were for direct. So if direct had a specific relationship in which there was a constant ratio, what do we think this is going to be? Opposite of dividing something. But the end result. So the end result of multiplication. Product. Inverse variation equations are written in the form y equals k over x. You should probably write this. Right? Just like we did for direct, we're gonna solve this for k. How would I get k by itself? Multiply by x on both sides. So that k equals y times x, where x times y doesn't matter. So direct is y equals kx, k equals y over x. Inverse is the opposite, y equals k over x, k equals yx. So inverse is going to move a little faster because it's really the same as direct. Once we know the equations, the process is the same. So we're going to use our equation for k to find our k value to see if there's constant between all of these. So if I were to multiply 1 and 20, 2 and 10, and 4 and 5, if I get the same k value, it is the constant. It is, because these are all 20. So then we would use that k value to write our equation, y equals 20 over x. Questions on that? Do the same thing in number 3 in the table, multiply x and y together. What do we get for those? For all of them? It's negative 12 for all of them. So that means that is our k value. How would we write this equation? Correct. Y equals negative 12 for x. Right, so if the value wasn't constant, then it wouldn't be inverse when you multiply, or if we're dividing, it wouldn't be direct. Questions on how we find k? Now, this next part, you don't need to graph, you won't need to graph for the quiz, for the test, but you'll need to know what it looks like. So we're going to graph one of these. So in this example, it says the constant is 16. That means I multiplied two numbers to get 16. So what times what would give me 16? 8 times 2, 4 times 4, is another one. Negatives, we'll talk about in a second, not 6. 1 and 16. Then I'm also going to take these two and flip them. So 2 and 8 and 16 and 1, so we can graph all of these points. So on your graph these points. These are counting by 2, so the ones that have 1 will have to go into these. So 8, 2, 4, 4, 1, 16, 2, 8, and 16, 1. So something like this. So once you have all those points, connect them to the best of your ability and draw arrows at the end. Okay. And then when I asked what numbers would make 16, Lucas also said negative. So we only use the positives, but 2 negatives would also make 16. So we're going to use these same numbers, but make them negative. Negative 1, negative 16, negative 2, negative 8, negative 4, negative 4, negative 8, negative 2, negative 8, negative. And plot those points.
Do you like that?
Yes. we basically get the same thing, but on the opposite side. This is the full graph. This is called a hyperbola. When you get to algebra 2/algebra 3/pre-calc, you'll do more with that. We won't do more with this, except you need to know what it looks like. So when you see this graph, this shape, you have to know this is inverse. Looks different than direct because direct is a line that goes to the origin. This is a curve, it has two parts. Questions on how to determine if something looks like an inverse graph? You just have to be able to recognize that. You don't have to graph it. Once you finish graphing, go on to the next page. I'm sorry, go, for those of you who had a separate page, go on to the single page. For those that just have one packet, go on to the next page. We're skipping the graphs. And starting with the finding missing value. So for you guys, it would be the single page. Unless you stay. So then we're gonna do the same things we did with direct. Use our two equations, which I'll write up here. Y equals K over X. And K equals Y times X. To find the missing values of this. So for number 7, if we were finding the Y value, use the two values you have to find K, multiply them together, 12 and 14. Figure out what that is.
168.
Okay. Then use your Y equals KX to solve for whatever you're missing. You don't know Y, so leave that as Y. 168 over negative 24. Figure out what Y is. Negative 7. So just like with our direct, if you wanted to double check this, I can multiply negative 7 and negative 24 and I should get 168, which does work. Questions on this? Like I said, it's really the same as direct. We're just using the different equations. We found Y, let's find X, so number 10. What would we do first? We're doing number 10.
Oh. K equals
Correct. So take the two numbers you know, multiply them together to get it's 63. Then take that number and your other order pair, set up your Y equals K over X. What would that look like? So it would start with negative 7. Negative 7 equals, correct, that is the Y. Negative 63 over X. How would we solve this for X? Multiplied by X on both sides. We have negative 7X equals negative 63. And then divide. So the X equals 9. And if I multiply that with a negative 7, I should get negative 63. Those work. Questions on that? Okay. Then same process, it just has more words. So let's try 11. If Y equals 9 when X equals negative 6, find X when Y equals 3. What would be our first step? How would we do that? In number 11. Yes. Which would give us looking for. Then we're finding x when y equals 3. How would we set up our equation? So this is just like number 10, multiplied by x on both sides. And divide both sides by 3. So that x equals -18. And then if I multiply 3 and -18, I should get negative. Question so far? Let's do one more of these. We found x, so let's find y. Number 14. If y equals -8 when x equals -7, find y when x equals -4. What's our first step? Find k by doing what? -18 is -7, which is 64, 56. Great. And then what's our next step? Yep, you're right. Y equals 56. -4. By that, what is y? -4. Any questions on how to solve for the missing value for inverse? Go to the next page or on the single sheet, flip it over. At the top, you have something like it was on direct. As one variable goes up, the other goes down, or vice versa. So you can think about that like the more you travel, the less gas you have. The less you travel in a car driving, the more gas you have. There are others. So let's do number 7. Time traveling varies inversely with the average speed. If a train travels between 2 cities in 3 hours at an average speed of 65 miles per hour, how long would it take at an average speed of 78 miles per hour? What's important there? I'm traveling 65 miles per hour. I'm just trying to highlight everything this 3 hours. Varies inversely, 78 miles per hour. Speed. And what are we looking for? Is that what we're looking for? How long it would take? So then, just like direct, whatever comes before the words varies inversely, varied inversely, inversely proportional, that's still your y, so that has not changed. Whatever comes after is still x, again, that has not changed. So every time you see something about time, that is y. Everything with average speed is x. So are we solving for y or for x? How long? For y. Right, so then just like before, set this up just like we were just solving. Find k by multiplying what two numbers? 3 and 65. So that we get 195. Y equals 195 divided by 30. I'm not putting labels with the k because it's not the same. It's not like constant, like direct is. So I'm not putting labels with that. But then divide that, what do we get? 2.5 what? How long? Hours. To make sure you're keeping those consistent, whatever you labeled it has to have the same unit label. All of these problems, 8, 9, and 10 are all solving for Y's, but we can do one more of those if you so choose. So you guys, I'll let you guys choose 8, 9, or 10. Okay. So the width of a rectangle varies inversely with its length. If the width is 4 when the length is 18, find the width when the length is 8. What's important there? The length varies inversely. The width is 4. Length is 18. Find the width when the length is. How would I start to solve this? How would we do that? 18, which would give us 72. Okay, and then how would we find the width? 72 over 8, which is 9. We don't really have units in this one. Usually it would say like inches, centimeters, whatever. So you just put units. Questions on that one? Okay, we're gonna do one more, any you guys wanna see, and then we'll be done for today. It's here, because it's the last house. For number 11, the time it takes to bake a turkey varies inversely with the oven temperature. If it takes 3 hours to bake a turkey at 300 degrees, find the constant of variation. What's important there? Time it takes varies inversely over the oven temperature, 300 degrees, 3 hours. Looking for the constant of variation. How would we start to solve this? Minus 300. 500. Is there anything else we have to do after that? Are there any questions on this one or any others on this page that we want to see you go over how to think about? Alright, so you don't have a whole lot of time, but I'll give you these options. You can keep working in your inverse packet. You can keep working in your direct packet. You have 2 delta maths that are due tomorrow. Even though I don't see you tomorrow, they are still due direct and inverse variation that you can work on. If you didn't do the linear regression that was due on Friday, you can keep working on that. You can do retake work. If you need to finish an assessment, you can still do that. You could be working on any of those things. And then in like 10 minutes, I'll let you work together. Let me know what questions you have. Yes.
Right?
I could check them right now.